roll A, take A.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Newsfeed. I'm Harvey Creasy. Today we will be discussing racial tensions on college campuses, specifically in the context of memorializing Confederate veterans. Today we have Professor Biko Agozino with us to talk about these topics. Dr. Agozino is a professor at Virginia Tech in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. His professional interests lie in multicultural criminology, theory, law, and social change, drug-free Africana medicine and Africana research methodology. In the spring of 2017, you brought up the issue of potentially changing certain building names to Dr. Minna Pratt-Clark, who's the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here, and she passed that on, and you followed up with Dr. Tim Sands, the university president. So I want to ask you, you said that that was a move motivated by students who were coming to you with complaints about certain buildings. Can you talk a little bit about that, just to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Harvey, for inviting me. Many of our students show concern that we have to give lectures or they have to live in dormitories that are named after slavery and slave holders, but also after commanders of the Confederate Army that waged a war against the United States. They wonder if the university could do anything to make changes in those names to reflect more the positive or progressive history of the United States of America and make all students feel welcome rather than feel unwanted or uncomfortable on campus. So I followed up with the Vice President for Diversity, and she told me that she would investigate and follow up with the concerns of the students in the spring of 2017. And in the fall, I kept getting similar concerns, so I followed up with President Sands, and I was informed that a committee has been set up to study the concerns of the students and see what changes, if necessary, could be made.
So you wanted to look into that before Charlottesville and before this kind of became a national conversation that's been taking place, is that right?
That is true.
So what I had here to ask you, do you think that we're living in post-racial America? Do you think that, you know, in 2017, that's something that we are past, or do you think that, as you mentioned, it's still something that we really need to be forming committees for and looking into?
That's a good question. The election of President Barack Obama was said by some to be an indication that America was finally moving into a post-racial society where people will be judged by the content of their characters rather than by the color of their skin, as Martin Luther King Jr. prophesied. But unfortunately, we're not yet there, and we still see racial tensions in the country, but also around the world, and specifically on college campuses as issues of concern, not just to black students or minorities, but also to a lot of white students and professors who feel that we could be a lot more welcoming in our policies, but also in our policy statements and representations.
Right. So you're currently teaching criminology and intro to Africana studies, correct?
Introduction to African Studies as part of Africana Studies program.
Okay. And so it was students from kind of all of those classes that were coming to you and complaining about these buildings? What were they saying?
The students are aware of the history of slavery on this campus, that this campus university was started as the Preston and Olin Institute for the education of the children of the masters of the plantation. And after the war, the Civil War, the land was acquired by the federal government and used to start Virginia Polytechnic Institute, which today is Virginia Tech.
Mm-hmm.
So the students are wondering whether we should keep the same landmarks
Right.
that we are put in place during a time that Virginia Tech was discriminatory against women and discriminatory against African Americans, American Indian natives, and other minorities. As we all know, Virginia Tech started in 1872 as an exclusively white male institution.
Right. So with that in mind, there are buildings that we will get to discussing those in a minute, but that have ties that were all named in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Do you think that that having them named so far after the time period when Virginia VPI was started, do you think that that kind of rehashes those old kind of the foundation of the university that certain students here would not necessarily want to bring up again?
Yes, I think the naming was a deliberate, institutionalized statement of discrimination, given that, as you said, that initially those buildings didn't have those names, but now we are honoring people like McBride, who was a commander in the Confederate Army that fought to keep slavery going in America, but ended up killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, most of them white. So the statement, the representation, the giving of the names to these characters by the university represents hate speech, institutionalized hate speech by the university, and hate speech is not free speech. The Supreme Court has ruled over and over again that making hateful speech is actionable. It can lead to damages and punitive awards against people who make hate speech. It is not part of the free speech that is promised in the principles of community that were put in place, signed in 2005 and renewed in 2015 by the university. Right. It is something for the university to consider that the institution started as a white supremacist institution and continues to memorialize and honor white supremacy by naming the buildings and landmarks on campus after slavery and after people who fought to keep slavery going, or even after a leader of the KKK.
So we're going to get to that after the break, but before we do that, you are a professor who has a lot of experience with this. What would you say are some questions that someone can ask him or herself to help them kind of identify their own racial biases?
Okay, the first question to ask is, what benefit do we get from being biased racially against or in terms of gender? There is no benefit to society or to individuals that can be associated with bias or hatred. Hatred is bad for society, but how about showing love and appreciation for all of our members of our community? Now, love is lovely and hate is doubly ugly because it hurts the person who is expressing the hatred and also hurts the people who are being targeted for hatred. There is no benefit to be got from being hateful, but a lot more benefits from showing love for the community and for individuals in our community.
All right, well, thank you for that. Coming up, we will speak to Amanda Fields, the Vice Chairman of College Republicans at Virginia Tech. She is one of the co-authors of a recent letter to the editor that appeared in the Collegiate Times about why we should keep the names as they are. We will be right back.
We'd do anything for kids. Yet 1 in 6 children in the U.S. struggle with hunger. Help end childhood hunger near you. Learn how at feedingamerica.org.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about racial tensions on college campuses, specifically in the context of reviewing monuments and buildings named after Confederate veterans. So we have Amanda Fields here, Vice Chairman of the College Republicans. Thank you for being here. Let's look at some of these buildings that we're going to be talking about. Located on the upper quad of the campus, Lane Hall was named after General James H. Lane, the first commandant of cadets here at Virginia Tech. He served as a general for the Confederate Army under Stonewall Jackson. Up until the 1950s, Lane Hall was referred to as Barracks Number 1. The building was completed in 1888, so it was about 60 years until it was named Lane Hall. Vawter Hall was dedicated on May 16, 1966, and named after Charles Vawter, Sr. He was a member of the Virginia Tech Board of Visitors, and also was the superintendent of a school for orphans, and also a veteran of the Civil War on the Confederate side. Preston's Restaurant in the Inn is named for the Preston family. They were the owners of Smithfield Plantation on campus, which was a working plantation that owned slaves. And McBride Hall is named for John McBride, the president of the university, known as the father of VPI, who really laid the foundation for modern Virginia Tech. And then, of course, Lee Hall, which we will get to in a moment, also has a controversial past. So, back to Amanda. Thank you for being here.
Yep.
So, your letter to the editor, first of all, before I say anything about it, why don't you just kind of go into what compelled you to write it? You and your co-authors feel that the names should not be changed. Why don't you just share with us?
Okay, yeah, so we didn't think the name should be changed, mostly because they do have ties to the Confederacy, but I think it's important to remember what they're being honored for, and it's
Right.
not the Confederacy that they're being honored
Correct.
for. They're being honored for what they contributed to Virginia Tech. And like McBride, he actually started the motto ut prosum. So if you want to get rid of the name McBride, where does it stop? Do you get rid of ut prosum? And I know the cadets still wear Southern gray. Do you get rid of that? Do you get rid of cadets? Because they were also,
Right.
so it's kind of like a slippery slope from there.
What is your response to that?
It is important to honor history and to memorialize history, but we can actually choose to honor the same history by choosing different heroes to be honored. As a matter of fact, when you consider the fact that 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War that was started by these characters that we are honoring, in many societies, they will be regarded as people who committed treason against their country. They will be put on trial or jailed. What kind of statement are we sending out if long after the crimes were committed against the United States and against the citizens and against the poor whites who were drafted to fight on the sides of the Confederacy, even though they didn't own any enslaved people? What kind of message are we sending out to the students we are educating when we continue to honor these people who did serious wrongs against the United States and against human beings in the United States? That is not free speech, because free speech is actually guaranteed to individuals, not to institutions. And when an institution makes a statement that is discriminatory and exclusionary against women, against African Americans, against American Indian natives, it never goes well for anybody in the society. See, 600,000 people died in the Civil War, and the Civil War was completely unnecessary. Slavery could have been ended in the US without having to fight a war.
So the nature of the letter to the editor was that the Virginia Tech history and what these 4+ individuals brought to the university should outweigh kind of their extracurricular activities. Is that correct?
Yeah, because you really can't change what the university was founded on. You can
Right.
change the names, but it's really never going to disappear.
Okay, well, I do want to talk about Claudius Lee. I don't believe he was mentioned in the letter to the editor, but he's been one of the more controversial figures in Virginia Tech's past. He was from, let's see, he was a member of the Bugle, which is Virginia Tech's yearbook, and in the 1896 edition, if we can get this, it shows that he was listed as the father of terror for the Virginia Tech chapter of the KKK. And it says, object to right the unrighteous, and it has Claudius Lee on there, and also noteworthy, as he's the father of terror, but the right hand of terror is O.M. Stull, who is actually credited with the hokey, 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 high, tech, tech, VPI chant that we all still do today. And you know, both of these men, and Claudius Lee went on to teach electrical engineering for somewhere between 40 and 50 years, and they definitely did impact the university, and they definitely helped shape what it is today. But after seeing these images, there's this one, but there's also this Pittsylvania club that the graphic shows what appears to be a black man being hanged from a tree, and then Claudius Lee is down here as well. And both of these have been reviewed. I guess this will be the third time, once in the 90s and then again in 2004. And there's a lot of discrepancy as to whether or not the KKK was even existing in this era, because apparently they kind of quit in the 1880s and they didn't kind of get back going until 1915. So a lot of people think, and then with Claudius Lee on the Bugle editorial board, they think it was a joke. But these images, I mean, I want to hear from both of you. Do you think that this was meant to be poking fun at Lee? Do you think that you know, it means something other than what we're looking at? And then I guess follow up from that, does this change anyone's mind about whether or not he should have a building named after him? We'll start with Biko.
Yes, I think the controversy over naming of the buildings after a character that makes speech that you can identify as hate speech on the university yearbook is distasteful. I'm saying this because the imagery that we find on the official document, that's the yearbook, is official or semi-official document, is an indication that it was an error, at least an error for the editors of the yearbook to include such hateful speech in the yearbook. In the sciences, in medicine, medical sciences, you find that the journals, top journals, retract hundreds of articles that are published in the journals because an error was found or a fraud was committed. But in universities and in the social sciences, we rarely ever retract any publication. I think that's an indication that we are not as serious in the pursuit of truth and justice as some of our colleagues in the sciences are. So if we can retract 100 articles from top peer-reviewed science journals, why couldn't we retract hateful speech that is found in the yearbook of the university? You might say it sounds like a joke, but the lynching of African Americans was never really a joke. It affected a lot of people who never did any wrong except for the color of their skin. And of course, lynching also affected a lot of poor whites. The question is, why should a university which recognizes that there was bias and that there was discrimination in the legacy of the university continue to defend the biased statements and discriminatory statements found in the yearbook as a joke? It is not a joke. It is hate speech that the university should dissociate itself from and maybe rename that hall the Hokies Hall.
So what do you think? Do you think, I mean, Lee was not mentioned in the letter to the editor. Is there any reasoning behind that? And then what do you think of these documents?
I don't think there was really any reason. Those were just the ones we were focusing on. But I would say, like, I don't think the university is necessarily defending this action because I don't think they would do that at all. I think it's more like just preserving what this university was founded on and, like, not necessarily the racism or Confederacy part of what it's founded on, but just, like, how it shaped the culture of the university. And I think when people choose where they're going to go to college, they look at the culture. And if they have a problem with how it was founded, they're not going to come here and change how it was founded. I think you have to take that with it or choose another school.
to your point, Amanda, on the university website, under Lee Hall, it gives a description of Claudius Lee, and then it does say that, that there's this controversy with these pages from the Bugle, and it says towards the end, the recommendations call for broader education on the subject of Claudius Lee and also for strengthening diversity efforts across the university. So I think in 2004-05, when it was reviewed last, it kind of ended on a note of we need to do better, but we don't need to change it. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Where did you live freshman year? Just curious.
East Campbell.
Okay, so I lived in Vawter, which is one of the buildings that is coming under controversy, and personally, I didn't even know anything about him. So, so I personally don't think I would have been affected by this, but would you say that if Campbell, you know, something came up and it had to be changed, would you say that would affect you?
Like just them changing the name?
Would you be upset if Campbell was changed?
Yeah, I would think that would be the same as all the other names.
Okay,
So, yeah.
well, we're going to take another quick break, and we are going to hear from Virginia Pellington, one of our reporters who did a man-on-the-street conversation with a bunch of students on whether or not they think the name should be changed.
Got a quarter?
Welcome back to this edition of the Newsfeed. Newsfeed reporter Virginia Pellington went to the streets of Blacksburg recently to ask students about the possibility of renaming these buildings.
I think that would be a very interesting idea, but I think it could be good and help a lot of students that are maybe struggling with the fact that those buildings are named after Confederate figures.
I think that the Confederacy had a lot of political agenda that wasn't in light of slavery. I think that oftentimes it gets sort of like whitewashed as slavery, but I mean, for one, states' rights was, I think, the primary issue of the Civil War. So I think that it would be an oversimplification to wipe these people from history just because we sort of attribute it to slavery at the moment.
I think that would be great. I think it's an important topic in this day and age. I think it's something that obviously is garnering a lot of attention around the nation, and I think as a university that wants to promote the principles of community, that would be a good way to show that we stand behind the entire student body, and that the more racist past of the university isn't something that we want to promote in today's current day and age.
I can't say anything because I'm not in the position to be offended by some of that stuff. So I don't believe that I have the right to say it's right or wrong, because personally I'm not affected by that like somebody else may be. So I don't have the right to judge that perception of it. I mean, if it were up to me, I mean, if it's been okay for the last 100-some years, I don't know why now it's all of a sudden a movement. But at the same time, like, there are obviously people who are affected that I may not understand that viewpoint, so I can't really say. But it's just it is strange to me that it's been a while and it has never been a problem. But I mean, who am I to say that it's not allowed to be?
That way we are.
We definitely, there's a lot of opinions on this campus, and we appreciate Virginia for going to learn about all that. So it sounds like lots of mixed reviews. I mean, that's nothing new for us. But I want to ask Amanda this. So I mentioned earlier that Lane Hall, which is one of the ones that's under review, was for 60, 70 years called Barracks Number 1, and then it was named Lane. Do you think at that point, which was sometime in the 1950s when they renamed it, do you think that then there was kind of this same outcry of, you know, changing history? I'm sure there were people, many graduates that lived in Barracks Number 1 or at least had class there or anything. It was like the center of the Corps of Cadets. It's one of the 2 oldest buildings on campus. Do you think that was changing, rewriting Virginia Tech's history as much as the conversation today?
No, because Barracks Number 1 is pretty general. It doesn't really hold any specific weight, the name at least. Whereas Lane, I think naming it was more of like, I think it was honoring him because he was the first commandant of the cadets. So no, I wouldn't say it would be the same.
And then I wanted to ask you, Biko, if a lot of the discussion we're having about McBride, Lane, Vaughter, and Lee, I would say that the general student body overall doesn't know this history. Would you agree with that?
That is true.
So would you say that the names carry as much weight if someone sees Vaughter, I lived there for a year, didn't ever know the history of it? Do you think that it affects people as much if they don't know the history behind it?
I believe so. Ignorance is always a very dangerous thing, especially within an educational institution where people should be trained to have awareness and to stand up against social injustice. You said that these names started coming up in the 1950s, the era when Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka came up, and there was a lot of resistance against the integration of schools in the U.S. Here, especially in the Roanoke region, schools were closed for 2 years in order not to have African American students go to the same schools as European American students. Now that hurt even the white students because they lost 2 years of schooling,
right.
And the use of public funding to support higher or school education in the U.S., especially in the South, was an initiative of African Americans after the ending of slavery. They demanded for land and learning. And a lot of the early schools dedicated to African Americans were being burned down, and teachers were being harassed because many poor whites were ignorant of the fact that education will be good for all. It's not just for African Americans. And today, when you look at it, with the case of affirmative action, which a lot of people mistakenly think is only for African Americans, affirmative action has benefited more white women than African Americans.
So just 2 quick points before I ask Amanda my next question, but it is something that we should say that Irving Pedrew III and Charles Yates are the names behind Pedrew Yates PY, the one of the dormitories on campus, and it's named for the first black student to enroll in Virginia Tech, which was in 1952, and Charles Yates, which was the first black graduate, which is 1957. So it definitely was a long time before Virginia Tech was admitting and enrolling black students. And then today, according per the university's website, we are 4% black and 63% white. So that's definitely something that we do need to keep talking about. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask Amanda about this piece of your letter. It says, a committee to review and potentially change building names does not benefit anyone. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the idea that names could really hurt someone, that doesn't really make sense, especially since that's not the reason they're named in the first place. And then also I think the resources could be going to things that would benefit the whole campus, like parking. We all need more parking. It's just, I think it's a waste of money to change names that, I mean, you can change the name, but the history is still going to be here, and it's really not going to change the culture of it.
What would you rather see us spend money on?
I think parking would be a really good one.
Okay, I think that, no, totally fine. We're running out of time. I do think that the committee that has been formed that will look at this they deal with this on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Minna Pratt-Clark is the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. So I do think that that definitely is something that they are paid to do and paid to look at. But before we wrap up, I wanted to really quickly mention that in Richmond, Virginia, the Monument Avenue is just tons of enormous Confederate monuments. And I do see a distinction between those, which are monuments to people who fought for the Confederacy, and these buildings who are just named for people. They're named for people who contributed to the university, but also were Confederate. So can we agree on that distinction before we go?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for being here. I hope we can continue this discussion in the future. We'll definitely have to see what the committee comes up with in the coming months and weeks. And so thank you again for being here. That will wrap up this special edition of the Newsfeed. A big thank you again to our guests for joining us today. Thanks for watching. I'm Harvey Creasy.